Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight to listen to an amazing story about one of the most fascinating aspects of World War II, the mass escape of Allied officers from a German POW camp in 1944. But first, I would like to thank the Friends of the Walpole Library, specifically Phil, Barry, and Mary for hosting me tonight and for all their preparation for this program. I greatly appreciate it. Much has been made of this event since the movie was released in 1963, but unfortunately, the distortion of the facts and characters that never existed leaves the impression that that was how it happened. It did not. The real story is one of great ingenuity, courage, and perseverance against an enemy that became more dangerous as time went on. As the war began to slip away from the Germans, even Allied officers faced an uncertain future if captured, as the war spun towards its inevitable conclusion. The prisoners fought against hunger on a daily basis, bitter cold in the winter, and brutal isolation from the outside world. For those Allied officers who had been behind the wire for years, the psychological toll was increasing. Escape for many was the only remedy. In early 1942, the air war over Germany was taking its toll on the Royal Air Force. Prisoner of war camps throughout Germany were bursting at the seams, and as February rolled around, rumors began to spread that the Germans were building a new camp somewhere in Upper Silesia near the Polish border. The Germans spent a great deal of time and effort on the construction of a new camp. It was to be situated far from any Allied or neutral country. Therefore, if escapes were attempted, they'd be extremely difficult, and recapture the likely result. For most airmen fortunate to survive their plane being shot down, the war took on a different role once they found themselves behind the wire. No longer were bombing runs or engaging enemy fighters the primary concerns. Now the airmen needed to survive, harass the enemy to the best of their ability, and escape. Sometimes just getting to the camp could be hazardous. Flight Lieutenant Nathaniel Fletcher of the Royal Air Force reflected on his own experience. How lucky I really felt was dawned on me when I later met RAF prisoners who were shot down while on bombing missions over Germany. They were attacked by angry civilians, brutally interrogated by the Gestapo, and packed into cattle cars, he wrote. The usual greeting from the German captors, "For you, the war is over," was the furthest thing from the truth. It now became a different kind of battle, a battle that involved physical and mental endurance, and still the possibility of death outside the wire. RAF air crews were regarded with some degree of respect by the Germans, and given their reputation as excellent soldiers, their escapes had a better chance of succeeding. Therefore, the new camp would have tight security. Stalag Luft 3, which translates into Main Camp Air 3 in German, was located just south of the town of Saga, now Żagań, Poland, approximately 100 miles southeast of Berlin. The camp was one of 6 POW camps operated by the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, for British and American airmen. The Wehrmacht, the German Army, and the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, also operated their own system of stalags. Geographically, the area was desolate, a perfect location for a POW camp. Winter temperatures plummeted below zero, and the surrounding countryside consisted of either flat farmland or dense pine forests. The Germans had learned a lot about incarcerating prisoners. They originally cut 2 new compounds out of the forest with 6 huts in each, and all of the huts were raised off the ground so the detection of tunnel activity could be more easily ascertained by the German ferrets, nicknames for guards whose duty it was to detect escape attempts. Later, the Germans would regret the fact that they built concrete foundations underneath the washrooms and the stoves. In addition, trapdoors were built in the floors and ceilings to make the process of inspection more efficient. Eventually, Stalag Luft 3 would expand to hold 10,000 POWs by war's end. The barbed wire fences had an ominous appearance. There were 2 fences with a gap of several yards between them and an overhang on the side facing the compound, which made them virtually impossible to scale. About 10 yards inside the double fence ran the warning wire. All prisoners knew that to cross the warning wire, meant certain harm from the machine guns situated in the guard towers, or goon boxes, as the prisoners referred to them, that were spaced at distances of about 100 yards. When the Germans chose the location of the camp, the composition of the soil was certainly an advantage for them. Under the topsoil was a yellow sand that would make dispersal an almost impossible task for anyone trying to tunnel out of the camp. Lastly, the huts were located a good distance from the wire, making tunneling a difficult affair. The new commandant of the camp was Colonel Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindener, a 61-year-old veteran of World War I and the winner of 2 Iron Crosses, which were for valor and bravery in battle. Although he joined the Luftwaffe and became a member of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's personal staff, von Lindener was not an adherent to the Nazi cause. When he was not allowed to retire, he made his way to Saigon as his commandant. Although food was in short supply, the POWs were treated fairly within the context of the Geneva Convention. It was the International Red Cross that saved the day for prisoners throughout the Reich. Since the camps provided only small rations for prisoners, the Red Cross provided 1 parcel per man per week. Each parcel contained soup, corned beef, powdered milk, Spam, chocolate, coffee, cheese, and real jam. Nonetheless, given the rigors of camp life and escape activities, one never had the satisfaction of experiencing a full stomach. The prisoners were always able to hoard enough foods for special occasions throughout the year, but food remained in the session. Late in 1942, Squadron Leader Roger J. Bushell, pictured here on the right, commanding officer of No. 92 Spitfire Squadron, arrived at Stalag Luft 3. In civilian life, Bushell was a downhill ski racing champion, a lawyer, and perfectly fluent in French and German. He had been shot down on May 23, 1940 during the Battle of France. Taken to a Luftwaffe transit camp, he subsequently escaped and almost made it across the Swiss border before being recaptured. He was then sent to Barth on the Baltic coast. After spending several months there, Bushell and a few others were being transferred to another camp when Bushell and a Czech officer in the RAF slipped under the floorboards of the truck they were riding in and made their way to Czechoslovakia. At the time, the assassination of SS Gruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich had taken place in Prague, and Czechoslovakia was in an uproar. Bushell was captured by the Gestapo and sent to Berlin for interrogation. Members of the Czech family that had harbored him were shot, and his Czech counterpart was sent to Kolditz, an impregnable castle that housed Allied POWs near Leipzig and Dresden in eastern Germany. At the time Bushell reached Saigon, his hatred of the Germans was evident. Although he did not divulge his experiences with the Gestapo, it is thought that their tactics disregarded the provisions guaranteed by the Geneva Convention, which guaranteed certain protections afforded prisoners of war. The senior British officer in camp, Air Commodore Herbert Massey, made Bushell Big X, the indisputable leader of the escape committee in camp. No one did anything without his permission. He would decide who made an escape and who didn't. He knew full well that if he escaped again and was recaptured, he would be shot. Big X began organizing his escape committee right away. Some of the most notorious escapers were gathered at Saigon. Crump Kerr Ramsey and Wally Floody were in charge of tunneling. The American A.P. Clark was put in charge of security. Ralph Abraham and Tommy Guest assumed control of the tailoring department, replicating German uniforms and civilian clothes. Johnny Travis created escape kits, while Tim Wallen and his forgers were copying ID papers and all sorts of passes. Forging was a painstaking and arduous task. Bob Vanderstoke described the dangers of forging. Most false papers were made with watercolor, which was risky because it runs when wet. Typewriter ribbon ink, stencil ink, and printing inks do not run when the papers get a little wet, you recall. And here's an example of a forgery that was produced at Stalag Luft 3. That's quite a high quality forgery considering what they had. Luckily, a number of guards proved helpful to the prisoners by providing maps, railway schedules, and a host of passes, many of which took up to a month to create. All in all, Bushel was able to assemble the most competent surveyors, forgers, tailors, engineers, and security experts for a mass breakout of over 200 men that would cause such a severe disruption that resources from the war effort would have to be diverted to the escapers. It was hoped that several men would be able to make their way back to England. The X organization had several adversaries within the camp who had to be controlled, particularly the ferrets, nicknames for those Germans who snooped around looking for suspicious activity. The two main ferrets were Corporal Karl Greasy, nicknamed Rubberneck, and Staff Sergeant Herman Glemnitz, whose camp name was Dinwiddie. Rubberneck was not a favorite of the prisoners. He did not like them, which was evident, and he had a distasteful personality. Glemnitz was a different sort of man, conscientious in his work, and he was the reason for many failed escape attempts. He was actually well liked by the prisoners and had the respect of many in the compound. Underneath Glemnitz and Greasy were several other ferrets, all which had to be closely observed. All ferrets could search any hut without warning, which made them extremely dangerous. Luckily, the prisoners instituted what's called the duty pilot system under the direction of George Harsh, the head of internal security. All Germans would be logged in and out of the camp to ensure that no German was left in the compound to sniff out escape activity. To protect the illicit work being done, a complex system of hand signals was used to warn the various departments of Germans in the compound, thus giving them time to conceal the work that was being carried out. This system did not fail the prisoners. By early 1943, Bushel and Floody had chosen the location of the 3 tunnels. Codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, Tom was to go from block 123, heading west toward the woods. This hut was farthest from the main gate, and thus received the longest warning of the snap inspection. The location of the trap was in the concrete floor by the chimney. Dick was to go from 122 and was to start in the washroom. An inside hut was not likely to be suspected. Harry was to head north from 104 and would be the least likely to be suspected because of the length involved. Harry was to begin under a stove in one end of 104. Delmar T. Spivey, an American, had the opportunity to inspect the traps. So skillfully were they constructed that I couldn't find the trap leading to any of the tunnels, even when I was told I was looking at it, said Spivey. The entrance was so cleverly hidden that I couldn't find it, even when I got down on my hands and knees and searched the spot that I knew it to be. And that is an example of a trap that went vertically down 30 feet and down to the main tunnel. And that's what Spivey couldn't find when he was on the floor looking, because it was so cleverly concealed. Bob Vanderstoke, a Dutch pilot, observed that there was a trap door 10 feet down the tunnel. So if the Germans found the trap and destroyed it, the real tunnel would be preserved, and the prisoners would still be able to access it from another location. The ingenuity of the prisoners was brilliant. For instance, to start Harry's trap, an old pickhead taken from a Russian POW was attached to a baseball bat and then used to hammer away until the dirt was reached. Many diversions took place outside the hut that helped mask the noise inside. Sand dispersal was a huge obstacle to overcome. The problem was how to spread the yellow sand among the ordinary garden soil. Peter Fanshawe came up with a brilliant idea to use trouser bags. And this is a picture taken after the escape that gives you an idea of how these worked. The legs of woolen underpants were cut off, and the ends were tied with a piece of string. The string went around the man's neck with the underpant legs inside the legs of his trousers. There was a pin attached to the bottom of each bag and a string tied to each pin. The strings went up the trousers to the pants pocket. At the trap, the bags would be filled, and then the penguin, which is what they were called, would go to a particular spot, pull the string, and out came the sand from the bottom of his pants legs. The actual tunneling was a very dangerous proposition. There were always 2 diggers working together, one facing toward the dig and one facing away. The man away dragged the dirt away from the face of the tunnel. Each tunnel was shored with bed boards. but there were often situations where the roof would cave in and the number 2 digger would have to pull the other one out, usually while he was choking on sand and dirt. A wooden railway system was used for sand removal, and the railway cars were pulled back and forth along the length of the tunnel by another member of the tunnel team. And this gives you a really good example of what it looked like inside the tunnel. This was taken after the escape as well, but it gives you an idea of what the trolley looked like, what the rails looked like, and actually how big it was when people were in the tunnel. So it was very, very small. At the bottom of each chamber, at each shaft, was a chamber that contained an air pump and a storage area. The tunnel was ventilated using old milk tins that were connected and laid under the floor of the tunnel. At the other end was an air intake pipe that led up to the surface. And these were some of the milk tins that they were given through their Red Cross parcels. And what they did was, this is what they used to put together, and they used for ventilation in the tunnel. So these would all be connected. They'd start at the top of the trap, go down the tunnel, and would be along the tunnel floor so that the tunnelers could be breathing fresh air while they were doing that arduous work. Fat lamps were used to light the tunnels. The fat from mutton soup or a similar concoction was put into a small container, and then a makeshift wick that was made from a drawstring of a worn set of pajamas was inserted. Fat lamps were smelly and created soot, so it was not the greatest lighting technique. However, when a prisoner stole 800 feet of electrical wire, the tunnels were wired for light after being connected to the camp's power source. Fat lamps did have to be used for daytime tunneling, as the camp's generator was not turned on during the day. So this is a great cross-section of what it looked like from Tunnel Harry underneath 104. So in the foreground, right here, this is the workshop right here. The tunnel is 30 feet, and you'll notice from the diagram that the Germans planted microphones underneath the ground so they could detect tunneling underneath. So the prisoners decided that they would have to go down 30 feet to prevent the Germans from listening to any of their tunnel activity. So this in between, there were 2 or 3 halfway houses, and these halfway houses were slightly bigger than the tunnel. And usually there would be a person sitting in there, and they would be pulling the trolley up and down the line. Okay, so this is a great cross section of what the tunnels look like. In mid-June 1943, a piece of news shook the prisoners. Russian prisoners were now clearing the trees on the south side of the fence so that the Americans would have their own compound. If the compound was finished before the tunnels, the Americans would miss out on the escape. Bushell decided to go all out on Tom because it was the longest. Work progressed until the tunnel was 260 feet long. Bushell decided it was long enough, even though it was some 40 feet short of the wood, but 140 feet outside the wire. However, one of the penguins was careless and left yellow sand on the ground before it was covered up. Glennett saw it, and the compound was abuzz with ferret activity. In the summer of 1943, Tom was finally discovered. It was a devastating piece of news. After the discovery, Bushell decided that it was important to lie low, so tunneling ceased for about 2 months. Unfortunately, soon after the Germans blew up Tom, the Americans were moved to their new compound. It was a hard day for the Americans, but the loss of Tom was most frustrating for the British and other Allied POWs who had already been behind the wire for several years. Excuse me. In late 1943, when the Germans were clearing the woods to the west where Dick was supposed to go, Harry seemed the only logical choice. It was decided to reopen Harry on January 10th, 1944. The escape committee decided to put the sand underneath the theater seats, as there was a gap between the floor of the theater and the ground below. While with the snow covering the ground, it would be impossible to hide the yellow sand outside. By the middle of February, Harry was 2/3 of the way complete. There were a few setbacks, but work on Harry continued to move forward. The mood was lighter among the prisoners. It did not last long as the escape business took on a more ominous air. At the end of February, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, issued an order that said every escaped Allied officer was to be handed over to the Gestapo. The recaptured officers were to be officially reported as escaped and not recaptured. Shortly after the news broke, the Gestapo paid a visit to Stalag Luft III, informing von Lindener that harsher measures would be meted out to future escapers. The Allied bombing campaign over Germany was taking its toll, and civilian casualties and the destruction of the German war machine were surely two main factors in the directive from Heinrich Himmler's office. The stakes grew higher in early March when the Gestapo issued what is known as the Kugel Order, Kugel bullet in German, stating that recaptured escapee officers other than British and American were to be taken in chains to Mauthausen concentration camp. The commandant at Mauthausen was instructed that prisoners transferred under the Kugel Order were not to be entered on the camp books, but instead taken to underground cells and either gassed or shot. After the order was issued, von Lindener assembled the senior officers, chaplains, and doctors and asked them to end all escape attempts. "It is not worth it, gentlemen," he said. "The public temper outside is running very high, particularly against the Allied air forces, and escapers may suffer harsh consequences. The war may be over in a year or two. It is not worth taking unnecessary risks now." Although the news brought a sense of uneasiness, the prisoners pushed forward. Harry was now 348 feet long. The surveyors had said it was 335 feet to the edge of the wood. The escape date was moving closer. As it did, the escapers began the process of teaming up in pairs. Over the course of the year, over 600 prisoners had been involved in the escape process. The escape committee in Big X decided that 200 should make the escape through Harry. The first 100 to go were the ones who had the best chances. This was largely based on the ability to survive outside the wire due to language capability, nationality, and knowledge of the territory. The second 100 were men who had contributed in some way to the daily operation. All of the places were determined by ballot, which took place a month or so prior to the escape. The exit order was decided by giving the first 30 places to train travelers with the best chances of a successful escape. The next 40 were given those whose contributions to the process had been indispensable. And the last 30 to the next most important workers. The remaining places were determined by the escape committee, and they were those whose names had not come up by ballot. By March 14th, the tunnel was finished. All that remained was to break the last foot or so of the exit shaft. The escape committee had decided to schedule the breakout on the night of the 23rd or 24th of March, as there was no moon on either of those nights. Escapers were briefed on their particular escape routes, and escape kits as well as clothes and food were distributed. Bushel and the committee met on the morning of March 24th, and it was decided that this was the night. The forgers began dating all the documents. The trapdoor was ready, and the anticipation around the camp was palpable. As night fell on the 24th, the first escapers began moving to Hut 104. By 8:40 p.m., the first group of prisoners entered the tunnel. Johnny Bull was in front and went up the shaft to loosen the ceiling boards. He could not do it, so Johnny Marshall went up after removing his escape clothes. They were already behind schedule, and as Marshall cleared the last bit of dirt from the tunnel ceiling, he poked his head out. Harry was short of the woods. Luckily, the guards were watching the compound and not the other side. Marshall descended and told Bushel. After recovering from the disappointment, Bushel and the others decided to use a signal rope. The escaper would wait at the top of the exit shaft, hold the rope that was tied to the ladder, and wait for two tugs and crawl out to the woods. It was now 10:30. The plane was now 90 minutes behind. Sentries circled the compound at regular intervals, but the men were able to get clear of the tunnel. However, delays were taking place in the tunnel. The cases that train travelers were carrying were taking a toll. Some cases were getting caught behind the frames in the tunnel, while other men held their cases too far in front of the trolley, causing it to dip. It was about 11:30, and only 6 escapers had followed the first 17 through the tunnel. To complicate matters, the air raid siren went off. Minutes later, with the power source cut, the lights went out in the tunnel, paralyzing the escape process. Alan Bryant recalled later that, quote, between 12 midnight and 1 o'clock, no one got up, end quote. Wings Day, who was at the base of the exit shaft, moved back through the tunnel to light the fat lamps. That took about half an hour, but more problems continued. Ropes broke on the trolleys. Frames were knocked out of place, causing sand to fall, which meant reframing the damaged section. Blanket rolls got caught on the frames and under the wheel of the trolley, causing them to derail. By 4:55 a.m., a total of 87 escapers had left 104. Roger's goal of getting 200 men out was not going to materialize. The men controlling the trap in 104 decided that number 87 was to be the last. The first traces of dawn were appearing on the horizon. The men traveling cross-country had the toughest going of all the escapers. Thomas Nelson endured terrible conditions. He remembered, the majority of people going through the woods like myself were heading for Czechoslovakia. They were somewhere between 50 and 100 kilometers from the Czech border. But it was a difficult border because it was mountainous. Nelson and his partner Dick Churchill traveled by night and slept during the day. So at a very early stage in our escape attempt, we had to wade through flooded streams, he said, and consequently we were very wet and uncomfortable. The conditions were extremely bad. We continued on this basis for 2 nights. Bob Vanderstoke, escaper number 18, was on his way to the railway station during the air raid and was actually stopped by a German soldier en route. Asked where he was going, Vanderstoke told the German he was a foreign worker and luckily was directed by the soldier to the shelter at the railway station. Meanwhile, near the exit hole, the situation was becoming more intense by the minute. One of the guards had deviated from his path and was heading straight for the hole. He was walking on the near side of the road closest to the woods. Mick Shand, a New Zealander, was lying face down in the snow, not moving a muscle. The guard came within a foot of the hole before he must have noticed the path made by the prisoners to the edge of the trees. He unslung his rifle and pointed it at Mick Shand. Lawrence Rebel Carter, just inside the trees, saw the entire situation develop. He jumped out from behind the trees, waving his arms, yelling, "Nick Sheehan! Nick Sheehan! Don't shoot." The guard fired a shot wildly as Shand ran into the woods. The game was up. Ken Rees, who was at the bottom of the shaft, recalled, "I heard the shot straight away and realized what had happened. I backed up very quickly. After the shot was heard, all the men who were in the tunnel scampered back to the safety of 104. Identity papers were destroyed and rations eaten in fear of German reprisals. The trap was closed and the covering stove returned to its original position. Soon, there was a tapping noise under the stove, and the ferret, Charlie Pills, emerged. The German reaction to the escape was not surprising. First, von Lindener made all the necessary calls up the chain of command, until a Großfahndung, the highest form of national alert, was issued. German troops, local police, Gestapo, and Landwacht, which is the Home Guard, were all informed. The Fuhrer was informed of the situation the morning of the escape. As expected, he flew into a rage and demanded that all the escapers be shot. Heinrich Himmler finally convinced Hitler that not all should be shot, for fear of reprisals on German soldiers, so the number 50 was settled upon. Slowly but surely, the escapers were turned over to the Gestapo. In small groups or alone, they were driven to remote locations and shot. All the Gestapo reports said the same thing, shot while escaping. All the bodies were subsequently cremated to destroy any evidence of their execution. Jimmy James was caught near the Czech border and was taken to a new camp. When he arrived, he asked another prisoner, "Where are we?" The prisoner replied, "Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and the only way up is up the chimney." Wings Day and Flying Officer Pavel Tobolsky had a different experience. Flying Officer Dabalski and I, Wednesday recalled, caught the 110 train for Berlin and got through without incident. We left the Silesian railway station separately, met outside, and made the contacts we wanted. We stayed the night in Berlin and went off to Stettin, which was on the Baltic coast. But the contacts which Tobolsky helped to make there failed. We made contact with 2 French prisoners of war about midnight on March 27th and 28th, and they housed us with a small French prisoner of war working party in a room in an unused factory. They told us that all the other Frenchmen were friends. However, on the next morning between 10 and 11 o'clock, after all the Frenchmen except 2 had gone to work, 2 Gestapo officials in plain clothes came in with revolvers. They had been betrayed. We were arrested and marched through the streets with our hands over our heads to the Gestapo headquarters at Stettin, Wednesday remembered. 3 men made it to freedom. Herr Bergsland and Jens Mueller made it back to England via Sweden, and Graham van der Stoke made it to Gibraltar. 50 escapers were shot by the Gestapo, 4 went to Sachsenhausen, and 2 to Colditz. Back at Stalag 3, von Lindemer had been arrested and taken away. He escaped execution. The new commandant, Colonel Franz Braun, had just taken over when the senior British officer was summoned for a meeting. Through an interpreter, Brown announced that 41 prisoners had been shot while escaping. When asked how many were wounded, the commandant replied that there were none. Soon, the number 41 grew to 50. Eventually, the prisoners were allowed to construct a memorial outside the camp. After the war, the British government began the task of tracking down those responsible for the murders. The Special Investigation Branch of the RAF began a painstaking task. Over the next several years, they accounted for 69 of the 72 criminals. Many were convicted and served prison sentences, while others were hanged for their roles in the murders. Some of the perpetrators disappeared into the Soviet bloc and were never tried. By May 1968, the last trial was over. The question remains, was it worth it? Roger Bushell wanted to break out as many men as he could to create internal havoc within the Reich. He certainly did that, and he and many others paid the ultimate price. I will close with a passage from George Harsh, one of the prisoners at the camp, in his foreword to Paul Brickhill's book, The Great Escape. To my mind, this is also the story of the Tower of Babel. The fact that this tower was in reverse and happened to be a tunnel is a minor point. What was important then, and is more so now, is that this Tower of Babel was successfully erected. It proved something important. In one magnificent gesture, the 76 ragged, verminous men of all nationalities who climbed out of that stinking hole in the ground in Silesia on that windy March night in 1944 thumbed their collective noses at the entire Third Reich and all it stood for. They triumphed through the only means left to them over an idea that was rotten from the core out. And they proved for all posterity that men working together can dig a damn deep hole in the ground or build a shining Tower of Babel. Thank you very much. Before I entertain any questions, in addition to the story behind the Great Escape, there's the aftermath of the Great Escape in terms of the archaeology of the site, which is pretty interesting. I want to show you a couple of photos from afterwards because this is really one of the most interesting aspects of this, because after the war, this prisoner of war camp was basically disassembled and just the forest began to regrow. And all the remains of the camp today can be found in that particular forest. Now, this particular slide that I'm showing you here, this is part of the memorial that was done at the site of the camp in the woods. So this line of stones right here follows the line of the Tunnel Harry. That's the exit right in front of the woods, right over there on the far side of the road. Okay? And the beginning is the other 300 plus feet on this side. Now, to give you an idea, the night of the Great Escape, normally the guard would be on this side of the road, and all those men probably, or most of them probably might have gotten out. But for some reason, he was walking over on this side of the road, and that's why he was able to discover the tunnel. So, and that's the entrance right there, and you can see, if you follow it all the way to the end, right there, that's the exit right there. That's the little sign on the piece of stone at the end of the tunnel. This was taken right after the escape. This is the actual hole where Tunnel Harry came out, and this is a German pretending he's escaping right here, and that's the rope that was used on the tunnel by the prisoners. This is an example of what the huts would look like at the time. This is obviously a reconstruction because near the site of the former camp is a museum, and part of the museum is a replica of not only pieces of the camp, but what a typical bunk room would look like. And this is the theater. This is the theater where they buried a lot of the sand, and as you walk through the woods, you will come across all of these. These were made of brick, and if you have a map of the camp, you can find almost anything that you want in this particular area. So it's pretty fascinating. And this is a great picture of the tunnel at the top of Harry, and you can see these are all the milk tins, the clean tins, that are all put together that are going down the shaft and providing air to the tunnelers in the tunnel. And in 2007, they did some digging on trying to find several of the tunnels, and this gives you an idea of how far down they were and how difficult it must have been to shore up that tunnel. That is very, very loose sand. And when the archaeologists were making their dig, there was a point where they decided it was so dangerous they had to call it off because they didn't want to go down any deeper for fear of a collapse. So the fact that the prisoners were able to do what they did is just a miraculous feat. And this right here is the location of the cooler. And Tunnel Harry goes right near this, probably right where the picture is being taken. And those are the slabs of all the cells that made up the cooler. And this is another replica in the camp. This is the fire pool. So this was located in the north compound, and that was used in case of a fire, and also sometimes prisoners in the summer would use it for swimming. And these are the remains of what the fat lamps were used right here. So the fat would go in here, they would put the wick in there, and that's what they would use in the tunnels to light the tunnels when they didn't have the electrical wire. And this right here, this is what they found in one of the archaeological digs. This is one of the stamps they used for the documents in order to give the escapers when they were making their way to the train station. And this is a great picture right here because this depicts the concrete that they had to get through in order to get into the ground. And that was not an easy task. And you can see that right here. So, and lastly, this is the remains of what was the hut where the Tunnel Tom came from. And the last picture I want to show, this is a good example of when you make a mistake as a tailor and you don't make the uniforms correctly, this is how you get caught outside the wire. So these two greatcoats are official size, and these two guys right here, they're posing with the German guards. So these are the British officers who tried to escape with the incorrect coat length. So that is my presentation for tonight. Does anybody have any questions about anything? Barry?
There was a photo just recently here that had a lot of David, in the corner, one of them was 4,000 bedboards.
Yes.
How did they get 4,000 bedboards without still be able to sleep in the bed?
That was very painful, very painful.
But I mean, wouldn't the beds be on the floor if they had no board?
They positioned the bedboard. It was very, very uncomfortable. I mean, normally you have about 6 bedboards on your bunk, but they'd lose about 3 of those on each one of them.
They'd have to have 2.
Yeah, they would figure out some other way to get some support in the bunk.
Yeah. So then still, the number of boards, if you lose 3 boards from one bed, you've got 4,000, and you've got over 3,000 beds you're talking about.
Yep, it's a huge camp. Remember, by 1945, there's 11,000 prisoners in this camp.
Oh. And so they would have to have the cooperation of all those huts to get those.
Yes, you would. You'd have to. Yep. And not only that, they took wood out of the ceilings. They took wood. A lot of the walls were double walls, so they took wood from behind there. They took wood from everywhere. It was the story about the electrical wire is one of the best ones, because the workmen were in the camp one day and they had a truck pulled up and there was electrical wire and they were doing some work in the camp, and a prisoner happened to go by, was able to steal it, and none of the German who lost that wire never admitted that anybody stole the wire, because that would have been it for him. So that was a big coup for the prisoners to be able to light that tunnel with an electrical system. So they just plugged into the camp source and that was it. So, yes.
What was the daily routine like for most of the prisoners? Did the Germans have structured activities for them, or they're just sitting around all day?
No, there'd be twice a day. They'd have to go out for roll call to make sure that everybody was there. But the prisoners basically created their own routine. They did a lot of things you wouldn't think that prisoners would do in a prisoner of war camp. They did do gardening, and that's for sure. They were given tools for gardening. They also had a theater. They put on plays. They had book groups. They took language classes by the other prisoners. They did athletic events. They did actually foot races around the camp. They did played hockey. They played soccer. There was a whole wide range of things that they did during the day. During the winter, difficult story. Boredom really set in, and it was really tough because winter in that particular part was pretty rough, very, very rough. So, but they had a wide variety of things they could do. So, yeah.
If an escapee were recaptured wearing a German uniform, would the Germans have a legal right under international law to shoot him as a spy?
That's a great question. I'm not sure of that, but they didn't really care. They didn't care. If they knew that you were an escaped prisoner, whether you were in civilian clothes or a German uniform, it didn't matter to them. Observing the Geneva Convention was not high on the list.
Yeah, that's why Generals Keitel and Jodl were hanged after the war.
Yeah.
They've been involved in the treatment of prisoners.
Yeah, to say the least. That among other things as well.
Like deporting Jews and so forth.
Yeah.
The movie deviates rather, at least to a certain extent, deviates rather widely from the reality. That Steve McQueen insisted on inserting the motorcycle chase. For example, I don't believe that ever happened.
No, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. That's why in the beginning of my talk I mentioned the things that were added into the movie that were not part of the real thing. And Steve McQueen
Was great.
Yeah, he was great and it was entertaining. However, there was no Steve McQueen. There was no motorcycle. There was none of that. And a lot of things you see in the movie that happened are not necessarily true. Like in the movie, here's a great example of things that you see at the very end of the movie. The two guys get on. They finally make it to the Baltic coast, and they get on a ship, and they stow away on a freighter, and they go off to freedom. Well, that that happened, that escape particularly happened at a different time and not during the Great Escape thing.
I was under the impression that they boarded the freighter on the Rhine.
No, they were not on the Rhine, they were on the Baltic.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they're on the Baltic. And so two of the real escapers who made it got to Sweden and then they made it to England. And the third made it to Gibraltar and then made his way to England. So a lot of the scenes you see in that movie are scenes that took place at another time, not necessarily during that time period where the Great Escape is taking place.
What about the scene where the resistance workers at a Café Suzette set up an ambush of German officers? A car pulls up and machine guns them. Did that happen?
I never read anything about that. Never read anything about that. So I'm not really sure about that. Anybody else? Well, thank you so much for coming. I greatly appreciate it.